So it's hard to believe it, but it's been 6 years that Big Thought and SMU Center on Research and Evaluation have been working together on the Dallas City of Learning project. And we're already gearing up for the 7th year.
Mm-hmm. So especially in complex projects like Dallas City of Learning, having a long-standing research and evaluation partnership that continues over time, it allows us to track and monitor projects like this ebb and flow. So there's no one study that is going to teach us everything that we want to know. So very much this is a cyclical investigation. We learn new things every time, and we come up with new questions as well.
So tonight, we want to do a quick recap, a tour of what we have established through previous summers, and then we want to turn to our latest findings. So we're going to cover what we know and some things that we still want to know. We're going to cover academics, but we're also going to look at access of programming, the quality of programming, and the dosage of programming, or how much kids are receiving. So we're going to wrap up this evening's address a little bit later on by kind of thinking about the health of our local out-of-school time ecosystem and where we can all continue to work together to open doors of opportunity and skill development for all of our youth.
So over time, we have been able to replicate locally what is known nationally. And this is that summer programs matter. They matter especially for academic outcomes, which we love to measure, right? So that's what our data will show us. But we've also been able to show that there is a meaningful threshold of about 30 days of programming where those impacts start to show up. And those 30 days can be stretched out over at least 2 summers. Importantly, and related to our shared commitment in this room to equity, we've also been able to see that summer programming matters most for students who need it most. And by this I mean students who start out the summer behind a little academically. When they participate in summer programming, they tend to improve more than their peers who started out more on track.
And previous summers have shown us emerging themes as well. For instance, in summer 2017, we saw that Dallas City of Learning was feasible. Programs were happening. Youth were engaged. Data was being collected, and that was happening at scale. And then we entered summer 2018, and we saw that it was replicable. We could do all of those things again.
In summer 2019, DCOL emerged as sustainable and impactful. So this was the first year that we were able to see some of those positive results on student outcomes. Things like better attendance, GPA, and STAR. But this was also the summer where we started to see a little bit more activation of the ecosystem. This was both in terms of sheer size, right? So number of programs, number of students served, but also in students going to more consecutive summers. That's where we got to see this really fun finding, frankly, where students who attended more than one summer tended to do the best. They were getting more of the good stuff, it seems, and so that was really showing up in the data. We also saw in this summer, and related to the data sharing, we were finally able to make sense of things that were likely already happening. So of course students were going multiple summers in a row. Of course students were going to multiple programs in a single summer, but we had never had the data coming in to show us that that was happening. The last thing that happened that summer was some data infrastructure work. Those of you who know me at all know I say data infrastructure like 10 times a day, where the ELIS platform, the Expanded Learning Information System that we have developed in close collaboration with Dallas After School and now with Dallas ISD, where we really started getting that up and running. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
And then that brings us to summer 2020. And the pandemic, and that showed us a lot about ourselves individually and our city. We saw that the DCOL network was creative and continued to be committed to the youth in our community. Of course, programming looked very different in summer 2020, It was a very difficult time for our providers. We know our caregivers and youth were experiencing enormous stress.
But looking at 2021, a theme that emerges is that DCOL was resilient and is still relevant. We can now say that through the disruption of COVID, the local expanded learning ecosystem was able to sustain effective programming. The positive impacts that we first saw in 2019 are once again evident. So one way we look at outcomes is GPA, and specifically beginning of year. So looking at those first 9 weeks of school, the first data that we can see after students have just wrapped up their summer learning experience. And we see across the board, elementary, middle, and high school students, when they participate in summer programming, they tend to do better at the beginning of the year. Forgive us as we take a little tour through the traditional measurement. Of course, we all know well that no test can give us the full measure of a child. It will not tell us about the impact of a single program or the effectiveness of any one teacher, but these data are meaningful as we try to make sense of how the out-of-school time system can bridge and support K-12 goals. So a quick reminder, there were no STAR tests in spring 2020, so we're looking at spring 21 data. And a reminder that across the board, locally and nationally, student achievement scores declined during this time, especially in math. Learning loss is real. It is widespread. However, what we see is that students who participated in DCOL summer programming in summer of 2020 did better on STAR the following spring than their peers who did not. So the data here shows us the percent of students in each age group who scored at the approaches level on their STAR reading and math tests. You can see that elementary students in summer programs either held steady or did not decline as much as peers who were not in programs. And middle school students improved compared to non-DCOL peers. The high school trends mirror these middle school findings.
So this data supports what you're going to hear from others throughout this evening. The potential for out-of-school time programs to address learning loss cannot be understated.
We'll show you just a little bit more here about what we are learning and relearning about multiple summers of participation. So first, we'll look at the sample of youth who participated in programming just in summer of 2020. These data mirror what you saw on the last slide, but for these analyses, we used an approach called propensity score matching. That gives us a little bit more of an apples to apples comparison when we're looking at students who participated and those who did not. So for all grade levels, and for both STAR reading and math, DCOL students were more likely than their matched non-DCOL peers to pass these tests. And the odds of passing ranged from 1.9 to 2.2 times higher. This is so important to highlight. It means that the creative work that was done by many of you in this room during that now very infamous summer, it mattered. Figuring out Zoom passwords and figuring out 6-foot distances and whatever else we were doing. I think I was on calls with some of you during that exact time. And it's showing up. We really want to make sure that that's part of the story that gets told tonight. So just quickly looking at 2 summers, when we added the students who also participated in 2019, we saw generally the same findings. One exception just being for high school algebra, where the difference for students in programming was higher, but not statistically significant. And then when we look at 3 summers, we had a much smaller sample of youth, and the results really just showed up in the middle school reading. I'll use this as an opportunity to plug more data collection. The small data set that we had here for the 3 years is really just a reminder that even though the DCOL footprint is truly large in the city, being able to match your enrolled students attending your program to their Dallas ISD data requires a lot of diligence in rostering so that they can show up in the findings. All right, so these findings, they really do give us good clarity and confidence about the kinds of findings that we see over and over, locally and nationally, about the connection between summer programming and academic outcomes. They also invite questions. For example, what about these sustained outcomes, even during summers, where programming looked radically different for a short period of time? But I'll turn it over to Greg now to talk a little bit more about what happened in summer 22 and where things are going from there.
So Annie and I are going to return a little bit later tonight to share a bit more specifically about summer 2022. But we wanted to provide a little bit of a teaser about what's to come. So in short, last summer represented a shift for Dallas City of Learning back towards pre-pandemic times. We were able to turn the curve and rebound a bit. There were 66 organizations that provided over 1,300 programs that cumulatively served over 47,000 participants. When we look at student-level enrollment, the reporting shows us that there were at least 22,600 unique participants served. Each of these are meaningful increases from the summer prior. We also saw that the method of program delivery continued to shift back to a majority in-person format. Of the 28% of programs that were virtual, only 29 of them were new for summer 22. The remaining were asynchronous programs that had been introduced in previous summers. And the attendance data for all participants totals at over 1.4 million hours, a tremendous increase year over year. This increase reflects the improved data collection that Annie was speaking to that can come when we return to in-person programming. When we look at the 23,000 or so unique students, we can see that while the average days of attendance for those youth declined, the hours of instruction increased. And this, again, I think it comes through that in-person dynamic. What we know is that we were returning to in-person, and so we had the ability to do longer program days, even if they were for shorter durations of time. There are further themes that are coming out through the data, and Annie and I look forward to rejoining you in just a few minutes to share more about what we're seeing. So as we mentioned earlier, analysis of summer 22 reveals a range of emerging themes. And so briefly, we want to speak to the components of a healthy ecosystem, a functioning ecosystem, and how DCOL reflects upon those elements. We want to take a little bit deeper look at access, dosage, and quality, but we want to do that through the lens of skill development. And finally, we want to close out by reflecting on the role that summer can and should be playing in combating not only summer learning loss, but in accelerating learning coming out of the pandemic and addressing the inequities and opportunity that we've been speaking to this evening.
So recent years have seen some additional work on both conceptualizing and studying local ecosystems, and especially expanded learning or out-of-school time ecosystems. And these really focus on both learning and development in all the places and all the ways that that can happen. As we've been spending some more time getting accustomed to those findings and those frameworks, we keep looking at each other saying, wait a second, all of those things are happening here. So we've got a couple of these key elements of what would be considered a successful learning ecosystem. And we want to talk a little bit about how they're each present in the Dallas City of Learning. This is through communities of practice, through partnerships, through programs, through people, that all of these things start showing up. So first, coordinated ecosystems expand and improve access to opportunities. We keep hearing that tonight. They help ensure adequate dosage of the programming. So you got to get enough of the good stuff to start seeing some of these changes start happening. Second, they provide a platform to continuously improve program quality and indeed to build a consensus in the community about what quality even means. Third, when key partners in the ecosystem collaborate well, getting and using reliable information becomes easier. We see examples of this through Dallas ISD's recent formalization of a research consortium with SMU and with our launch of the ELLIS, Expanded Learning Information 2.0 dashboard coming later this spring. Next, successful ecosystem-based collaborations like this one help promote new and ongoing partnerships. You are probably here tonight because you also believe that no one entity can do this alone. Last, the partnerships help scale the work and ensure saturation. This means both within specific communities that may need the opportunities most, but also more broadly across the whole city.
So we wanted to speak to one example, a recent example of this scaling and saturation idea, and it's through partnership. So over the past 6 months, in part through collaboration between Big Thought, Dallas After School, SMU Core, and Dallas ISD's Extended Learning Opportunities Office, we now have the opportunity to see sort of holistically what's going on in our community, both community-based summer and after-school programming and district-based summer and after-school programming. And having this fuller picture is going to help us inform decision-making, fill gaps, and continue to improve holistically. So the connection between summer programs and academic outcomes are well established, nationally, locally. We've spoken to that this evening. And this is a critical and meaningful link, and yet we know it's not the whole view of what really happens in the expanded learning time. There is no single story for summer. So as previously noted, the access and dosage indicators for this past summer were very positive, and they showed great year-over-year gains. But beyond these high-level findings, it's important that we start to look a little bit deeper at the types of skill development that's happening within the programs. We want to know what participation looks like across different types of skill building. And so following Summer 21, we made a decision to sort of overhaul how we were categorizing programs and instead start to align them to Big Thought's creator archetype framework, which Byron spoke to a little bit earlier here today. So if you can see in the chart, as we look at the programming that happened this past summer, what we start to see is that the highest percentage of programs, participants, and dosage aligns with the academics and artistry domain. It accounts for over half of the programs offered and reached nearly 3/4 of all of the participants. Interestingly, while only 12% of programs technically aligned with social and emotional foundations, those programs also reached nearly 3/4 of all participants, but only 20% of dosage. Conversely, programs aligning with digital fluency, design thinking, and civics and services reached much smaller percentages of youth, signifying that these programs are likely much smaller in scale as they're operating. And so what's the implication of this for the Dallas City of Learning system? It means that there's an opportunity and likely a need for us to continue to engage with more partners whose programs specialize in these areas of skill development and continue to grow the ecosystem.
So considering that academics and artistry is the largest footprint, we wanted to do a little bit deeper dive into these data. So here we can see that the category of academic remediation was the most frequent program type up there at the beginning, at the top. And this was followed by science and STEM. These programs largely represent summer-led district programming that was part of an overall learning loss and recovery approach. But you can also see that other more common types of programs were literacy and poetry, instrumental music, and theater experiences. So a little bit of a both and takeaway here. While academics and remediation have a large and quite necessary footprint in summer offerings, we also see a wide range of different types of programs also show up here.
And so we also know that there's a wide variety in the ages of students that are participating in the summer. DCOL participants range from the very young, under 5, all the way up to young adulthood. And so we did a heat map analysis to kind of look at the program offerings by each of these age bands. And it reiterates the same thing, that academics and artistry was not just most prevalent, but most prevalent across all age bands. Social emotional programming was one of the least prevalent across all ages, except for middle school. While design thinking had low overall percentages of youth participants, the spread of programming across age bands was fairly balanced. And then civics and service programming was most prevalent in those 2 highest or oldest age bands.
So each summer, partners are also surveyed to measure perceptions of quality and overall satisfaction. Quality scores are calculated based on answers to 5 survey questions. In 22, favorable responses remained high, and composite scores are higher than pre-pandemic scores. Satisfaction scores dipped slightly in 22, but they still remain high, 9.5 on a 10-point scale, and similarly remain higher than pre-pandemic scores. Just like access and dosage, these survey results around quality are also disaggregated by those creator archetype domains. And the 2 domains with the highest student satisfaction scores were digital fluency and design thinking.
So DCOL is an ecosystem that's ultimately fueled by relationships. Whether that be the relationships between Big Thought and partners or the relationships you all have with the families and students that you serve. And we're now 2 years past that summer of 2020. And what's coming more into focus as we look at that satisfaction and quality data is that the programs in 2020 and 2021 were not of an absolute higher quality. That's not what was happening. In fact, we know that probably wasn't the case because we were all struggling to try to figure out, how do I make a program virtual? How do I make that engaging? Okay, now we're getting back into the classroom, but I've got to stay 6 feet apart. It was challenging. So what's really coming to light for us, what's coming into focus, is that these programs were needed. They were more meaningful to youth and families that were being served. If we recall that these summer programs were oftentimes the first opportunity that youth had to re-engage and re-implement with other people after periods of shutdown and isolation. And so what this brings home for us is that there's a simple power of just showing up as well, of being there for our youth and families when there is a need. And summer is still an underutilized resource, not just for addressing acute learning loss, but also in addressing more long-term and persistent inequities of opportunity. So every summer, we look at how many youth experience multiple programs and how many youth are experiencing multiple summers of programming. And I'm happy to say that in 2022, both of these areas showed strong improvement from 21. And it's encouraging to see that. But in both cases, it's still a relatively small number of youth, considering the overall scope of participants in Dallas City of Learning. And so in short, we have an opportunity to do even more. And so as the research from RAND and CORE has proven, summer can be effective in addressing summer learning loss, which in turn makes it an important tool in combating learning loss in general. And yet the potential benefits are more than just academics. They include exposure and development of critical life and work-ready skills that holistically help support our youth and their development.
Thank you. So Dallas County has over 650,000 youth under the age of 18. Our potential as an out-of-school time community is our collective expertise and our capacity. It is our willingness to value and to support all of the places where youth learn and develop.
So in closing, it's incumbent on each of us to serve to the fullest of our abilities and to make a part of that service helping youth connect to other opportunities. We must continue to work together to build and maintain a system of connection, relevance, and impact. We want to again thank each of you for your continued support of Dallas City of Learning, and more importantly, to your support of the youth that you are serving each and every day. It's through you that they have access to these rich and varied learning opportunities, and we're grateful for your contributions. Thank y'all.